From Unity Church of Christianity in Houston, Texas, this is The Awakened Life with Reverend Howard Caesar. Unity is a non-denominational Christian church providing a positive, practical, and progressive approach to Christianity. Let's join the service in progress with the Reverend Howard Caesar.
Today's theme is really on what is new thought, and as was mentioned earlier, there is a film on it today, and so I thought, you know, and the staff suggested it might be good to have kind of like the whole theme be around that. And so what is new thought, how it came about, what contributed to the formation of it, the creation of it, what and who were the major contributors, that type of thing. And I'm going to give you kind of a compact sharing of that. Because it's a lot of information really that came together. But it's important that we know this because it's what we are. What we are is new thought, and that's what we're categorized. And Unity is a new thought religion, not New Age. Get that? New thought, not New Age, which contains sometimes some new thought, but it has many elements. New Age is about astrology and numerology and Christology and psychic readings and tarot card readings and things like that. And wherever you may be on that, that's not what we're about, okay? And you may have an interest in astrology, and that's fine, or whatever. But that's not what we're teaching. That's not under new thought, okay? And Unity is a spiritual movement, and it exists in various places around the country and in various parts of the world. It has a world headquarters that has 1,500 and some acres, and it has a ministerial school there, and it has its founders, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, and it has its beginnings, which took place in the late 1800s, which the year that is given for its beginning is 1889. And it's a movement within a movement. It's a movement within a movement called New Thought, as there are other branches of New Thought. There's Unity, there was Religious Science, which is called now Centers for Spiritual Living, and there's Divine Science and all of these others. So New Thought includes a number of spiritual movements really that rose up in the 1800s, mainly the late 1800s and the early 1900s, actually. There's a lot of things that were happening that came together to cause this, and I'll try and give you a synopsis of that. But it had to do with the combining of, to a degree, the combining of religion and science, as science was beginning to be discovered, the science of the mind, really, and it had to do with the important role that the mind plays in a person's life and health and well-being, and that was just coming to the forefront as a big factor. The name New Thought really didn't mean that what they offered in teachings hadn't been thought of before. It really is New Thought, Ancient Wisdom. It is a revival or bringing forth into a new era of time, the current era of time, a new thought around what was traditionally being held as the main thought and thinking of the day in terms of religion. So it's kind of like, here's what tradition may say, but here's a new thought. You know, here's another thought. Here's a possible higher thought. And so a new thought could lead also to a new life, based on the laws and principles of mind that were emerging. And so this was a new religion that was born in the United States. William James said that this was the truly first real American-born religion. All the others came with us from Europe, and that this was actually birthed here. Christianity in the West, the United States, in the 1800s was quite rigid in its presentation, okay? Think back to the 1800s. If you did any reading and studying, the doctrine and the dogma was not very open to deviation. It was very little. It was cut and dried. There wasn't room for deviation. There wasn't room for free thinkers or deep questioning. It just wasn't there. And it wasn't very positive. It was sort of harsh in its presentation. A lot of the motivation was to drive people to God through fear and guilt, and that was pretty dominant. Now, Unity has always been about the teachings of Jesus Christ, but in a more progressive way. It's been a non-literal, metaphysical kind of view. That there are aspects to the scriptures that scholars have determined that are beyond literal, that are metaphysical, that are mystical, that are allegorical and symbolical. You know, where it says, if the eye offend thee, pluck it out. It was not to really be taken literally. If your hand offend thee, cut it off. Those are expressions, and you have to understand what was being said in that day and time as well. So history and scholars tell us that in the first century after Jesus' death, in the first basic 100 years of Christianity, there were 5 theological schools of Christianity that were at work, and they did not agree. Okay? Already in the first 100 years, they had differing views. And 3 of the 5 of those schools were said to be liberal. We're not talking politically. We're talking about liberal in spiritual interpretation. They were about metaphysical or symbolic or allegorical or mystical deeper meanings contained. And it was basically at various times that tried to be squelched, but it kept coming back. And you could say that Unity and New Thought has sought to be one of those to keep that alive, and that element of spirituality and Christianity, the mystical, the metaphysical. And so a new thought or a new approach then was being sought by people. Give me a new thought. I want something more progressive or deeper or whatever. A number of people who were Christian and were studied and well-read and what have you, they were questioning Christians, and there have been in every time, but they wanted room for more perspective, more interpretations, more teachings than what was the rigid presentation of that day. We're talking about 1800s, okay? Early 1800s even. So there were a number of things that contributed to this introduction of some teachings that was actually made up of ancient wisdom, or its source filtered in from ancient texts from the East. That was one of the strands that made its way in as a part of New Thought. So it was an element of a blending of Eastern and Western thought, and I'll share more around that. But one thing was that there was the emergence of these Eastern teachings being brought into the consciousness of America, bit by bit. And all the New Thought movements were actually influenced to some degree by the teachings of the East, some of these sacred texts, specifically the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedanta, the Upanishads. Some ideas were lifted and woven into the new teachings. And there were actually many things happening around that time. And one of them was the Eastern teachings. But keep in mind, the United States at this time was very young. It wasn't even 100 years old. And so there was a certain amount of east to west flow of ideas that were happening, slow and spurts and what have you. And the Vedas, you know, are known to be the world's oldest and most ancient sacred texts. They've been around a long time, so people would be interested in them. But they weren't able to really digest them because they had never been translated into English. And then in the early 1800s, there were some British scholars that took it upon themselves to produce for the first time, an English translation of India's sacred texts. Now, that was a big deal, that happening, because now, where people had always labeled it and were, things we're not familiar with, we put down or we distort, we don't have the right information on, we don't have a first-hand experience of, and so all of that misunderstanding went out the window because now it was translated into English. Now it could be read by an individual. Now it could be understood, and it began to gain credibility and interest bit by bit. And it's an interesting thing to point out that about Hinduism, actually, is that it has no central authority. It has no founding figure. It has no historical starting point. It has no single creed or canonical doctrine. It has many holy books rather than one. And all of these things add up to the reasons why it has been called by some the world's largest disorganized religion. And that appeals to some people. So anyway, back to the progression of New Thought. We want to go back to, actually, I think it's even the late 1700s, early 1800s, when a man emerged. His name was Antoine Mesmer. And Antoine Mesmer, it comes from his name, you get the word mesmerized, mesmerism, okay? And he was about studying magnets. And keep in mind, this was back at a time when they were trying to help people, and they were looking for alternatives because healing methods, doctors, hospitals didn't exist. The sophistication that we have today just didn't exist. So there are many people that couldn't be helped, and they were looking for other things. So Antoine Mesmer was looking into magnets, and he knew that something invisible caused them to contract or repel, attract. And so he would work with magnets. Well, another big name in New Thought, and actually many refer to as the father of New Thought, was named Phineas Parker Quimby, okay? And his work was kind of like the 1830s to the about 1860s. And he looked into the work of Antoine Mesmer and found it to be a whole lot more and really related it back to the mind. And he began to really discover the role that the mind plays in healing and physical healing and in health and well-being and happiness and all this. And so he began to just have tremendous discoveries around that and the role. And he was the one that brought the word science into an association with the mind. And so later you have all these movements that were religious science, divine science, Christian science, all of that. And that was because of the impact that the work of Phineas Parker Quimby had. And he said, he's very interested in the teachings of Jesus, and I'm very committed to him and his work, of course. And he said Jesus was the man, Christ was his science. See, Christ was not his name, it was a stature, it was a level of understanding, and that was his science. And so he learned to do amazing things in terms of the aspect of the mind. He discovered the subconscious. The word subconscious didn't even exist back then. There were not psychologists in psychology, and so he was really on the beginning edges of these things. So back to this translation of the texts, the sacred texts. These first translations of India's sacred texts, all this is going on at the same time, understand? So all of these are strands coming together at the same time to eventually form what became New Thought. And these translations fell into the hands of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Thoreau, Walt Whitman, some pretty powerful people. And Emerson was said to be the first who openly and publicly introduced these Eastern religious precepts in the West, in the new America. And Emerson, of course, was a seeker of universal principles, and he was about discarding beliefs, Christian or otherwise, that did not hold up to scrutiny, okay? And I found that both Emerson and Thoreau actually had mystical experience that they couldn't comprehend or understand until they began to be exposed to these Eastern texts, and then it became more clear what had gone on for them. In one journal entry, Emerson in 1837 wrote, "I behold with awe and delight many illustrations of the one universal mind." See, they were introduced now to the one universal mind that is the presence, the one divine intelligence. And he said, "I see my being embedded in it. A certain wandering light comes to me, and I see that it is not one and I another, but this is the life of my life. In certain moments I have known that I existed directly from God." So it's a deep mystical experience here. And Emerson saw the individual as a spiritual being, and that a big part of life was that we were to be evolving in consciousness, not be stuck in a rigid set of ideas, but we should be continually opening up to a deeper understanding. And so he said, in man, the perpetual progress is from the individual to the universal, and from that which is human to that which is divine. So that's, it's a progression. And he deviated from the teachings of a fallen, sinful humanity, separate and apart from God, which was being promoted at that time, and it was the teachings of the church of the day. And he said that there was a divine essence that existed within everyone. What we teach today, right? Emerson was one who encouraged this idea of thinking out of the box. And of course, this cost him a little bit because he was asked to do a presentation at Harvard, which was where he went to school, and gave the Harvard Divinity School address to the graduating class. And what he said was, "Let me admonish you, first of all, to go it alone, to refuse the good models, and even those sacred in the imagination of men, and dare to love God without mediator or veil. Cast behind you all conformity, and acquaint men firsthand with deity." So he was saying, we don't need a middle person anymore. You can have a firsthand experience with God. This is what we've been teaching ever since New Thought was birthed, okay? And so for this, he proposed basically a new metaphysics of consciousness in which the central obstacle to fulfillment for man is not an inherent depravity, but it's simply the ignorance of one's own divine nature. You've got to begin to identify with not depravity, but with your divinity, okay? And so anyway, Emerson was banned he was banned from speaking at his alma mater and for 28 years. And he was labeled a rebel. And then all of these ideas started to begin to be latched onto and respected. And 28 years later, he was invited back as a celebrated public figure. And they gave to him an honorary degree. So it's interesting how you introduce some ideas and there it's like, oh God, I want nothing to do with it. And then all of a sudden, when people really understand and get a bit of it, it makes its way into the consciousness of the masses because it has benefits. And so when Thoreau was went to the little cabin on Walden Pond, he took just a little handful of books, and one of them was the Bhagavad Gita. So again, they were very much, these ideas began to infiltrate into what were already Christian teachings. They weren't abandoning them, they were just integrating some ideas into what was. And so there was the trickle-down effect, basically. India's ancient texts had inspired Emerson. Thoreau, a student of Emerson, Emerson inspired Thoreau, and so Thoreau inspired actually Gandhi, and Gandhi inspired Martin Luther King in some of these ideas along with the principles of nonviolence. And so that's the way it happens. It just kind of has fingers going out, and that continues to this day. And so there were those who were transcendent thinkers, transcending what was, and some of the limiting ideas, and so they became known as the Transcendentalists. And there's a whole lot you can study about that. But going back to Phineas Parker Quimby, who was said to be the father of New Thought, and some say Emerson as well. They, fought over who was father, and not really, they didn't fight. But anyway, Phineas Parker Quimby, in his work in the 1800s, had a person come to him, and her name was Mary Baker Eddy, and she was in need of healing. Mary Baker Eddy, I think most of you know. Anyway, she was healed using the methods that he had discovered and uncovered. And so she began to study his methods, and then later formed a movement called Christian Science. She took that word science and so forth, and there was some controversy because she denied that she had gotten her ideas anywhere. And basically they were right from Quimby, and that's okay because she really got the ideas out there. We don't know if Quimby ever would have. And so after Quimby's death, they found some letters in a drawer of his that Mary Baker Eddy had sent to him, thanking him for his help in healing and ideas and things that he had contributed to her. Anyway, an interesting note is that in 1975, Eddy published what was called, Science and Health, a Key to the Scriptures. That is their main text in Christian Science. And in the first 33 editions, Mary Baker Eddy quoted the Bhagavad Gita. And then after that 33rd edition, it was removed. And it isn't there anymore. Who knows why? But anyway, Christian Science is not considered New Thought. It does not fall under the umbrella of New Thought. It has some similarities, but basically it's somewhat rigid in holding to things exactly how Mary Baker Eddy said it and not going outside of those boundaries. So there is no openness to going beyond. And so you had a person named Emma Curtis Hopkins. It's a big, important name in New Thought. She had worked with Mary Baker Eddy for a time and had some ideas that were expanding in her and began to share and write them down. And basically, they had a falling out because you weren't able to do that with Mary Baker Eddy. So she went and left and formed her own metaphysical college, one in New York and one in Boston. And she became known as the mother of New Thought and the teacher of teachers, because she was an incredible teacher, and all these people that came to her schools were people that graduated and emerged from there and went out and formed movements. The Fillmores studied under her and formed Unity, and Ernest Holmes formed Religious Science, which is now the Centers for Spiritual Living, and the Divine Science, and all these, and more. So there are many, many things that filtered out of the teachings of Emma Curtis Hopkins. And another interesting, and there's so many names we're not going to get to that played a role, but one that some of you are familiar with is Emmett Fox, a great author and speaker. Many books he wrote, and he was kind of in the middle 90s. The middle 1990s. 1900s, I'm sorry. So correct me if I'm wrong. It was the middle 1900s that Emmett Fox really did a lot of his work, and he spoke at Carnegie Hall to thousands of people on a regular basis. And it's a fact that when Alcoholics Anonymous began to form and they had not yet created the big book, the book that they studied was The Sermon on the Mount by Emmett Fox. So obviously, many of these ideas were in alignment with AA, higher power, one God. We're all, many, many things were integrated into that dynamic as well. Then you had Norman Vincent Peale, who was a young minister in New York. He was trying to find himself and what he would be about as a minister. He was kind of searching. And so he went to Carnegie Hall and listened to Emmett Fox several times. And guess what? He came away with this whole positive, upbeat message, which was New Thought. Okay, and he took that to the masses with guideposts and everything else that went on. And he openly admitted that, the writings of Charles Fillmore and Ernest Holmes regarding the power of the mind had really influenced him. And even the title of his book, his bestseller, The Power of Positive Thinking, he said he had basically got the idea having read an article by Charles Fillmore, co-founder of Unity. So he was very much into reading the writings of New Thought back then. Robert Schuller, a protege of Peale, possibility thinking, same idea. He also shared that he owed a debt of gratitude to Unity and was quoted to say, "Much of what I do is based on Unity principles." One of the newest speakers and authors who has embraced much of New Thought and teachings and principles is Joel Osteen. And Joel Osteen is doing a great, phenomenal job. I admire and respect him. And I would say that about 80% of what he is about is New Thought. And about 20% blended in there is kind of traditional Christianity to some extent. But it is a very, very positive message. And you have to understand that I knew Joel a little bit through his father. I knew his father. We buddied up, and he loved the Unity message. And so Joel, not having gone to any seminary, and his father dies and he's had to take over, it was natural for him, having conversations with his dad about New Thought and these ideas of unity, and that he would begin to gravitate there. And so I know that he's done a lot of reading, and he uses much of New Thought as sources for a lot of what he teaches. Again, not all, but some degree, and many have said it sounds like unity when you hear Joel. And bless his heart, I'm just so happy for him that he's doing well. New Thought, in its purest sense, is then an umbrella of relatively small movements like Unity and Centers for Spiritual Living, but the ideas of New Thought have been adopted by so many, and in so many ways they've just splintered out and had an effect everywhere. And so the profusion of self-help books has really had its origins in New Thought, and it was ways in which to get it to the secular world in some way. People like Wayne Dyer, Dr. Wayne Dyer, he really didn't know what New Thought was until he had his first book out there, and then he got invited to a few New Thought churches, and then began to be exposed to what is this about. And he really related to it and just took that in another way to the world without having to be attached to a particular church. It was a beautiful thing. You have others like Louise Hay. She even attended our church several times when she was living in Houston for a short time. Knew her a bit. Maya Angelou, and crediting Unity for having changed her life. Oprah Winfrey has just one speaker after another that's all in the genre of new thought. And she had on her desk, on Oprah magazine, showed her desk, and she had there on it the Daily Word, which is a daily devotional magazine that is published by Unity. She can't come out and say, I'm a new thoughter, but my gosh, all the people that she marches through, their speakers and what have you, are nothing but. And so what do we emphasize in New Thought? What's it about? It's about the power of thought that came into being. Positive thinking, yes, but it's more than that. It's mastering your mind. It's the idea that thought is creative. Change your mind, you change your life. The Apostle Paul said, be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. There is the law of mind, okay? And Paul said in Romans 8, he said, I see another law, the law of my mind. So then with the mind, I myself serve the law of God. So it's talked about biblical, the law of mind. It emphasizes that at your core, you are divine, that you are a Christ in the making. And Paul, again, Colossians 1, he said, the secret hidden for ages and generations, which is Christ in you, your hope of glory. And in Colossians 2, Christ is all and in all. And then Paul, in Romans, he is quoted to say, the Spirit itself, meaning God is Spirit, we know that, biblical. The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ. So we're all children of God. We're all sons of God in the making. Jesus was the great example, not the great exception. He was trying to call us into being sons of God, completing that as a potential, as was said by Paul, for as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are sons of God, okay? We had an emphasis in New Thought on the inner dimension, and Paul in Romans says, for I delight in the law of God after the inward man. I delight in going into experiencing the inward man. Jesus said, the things that I do, you can do also, even greater things than these if you believe. It's the nature of God as good, okay? We say that again and again. Does not punish, that God is everywhere present. We teach universal principles. It's inclusive, not exclusive. It denies no one, embraces all, honors all paths. It's the idea that we pre-existed this life. The emphasis on a direct experience with God. That separation, really, consciousness is the cause of all suffering. That we are truly all one. And that most importantly, our whole purpose really is to rise in spiritual consciousness individually and collectively as a body, so that we can really move into a life of health and happiness and fulfillment individually and collectively, that we can actually be a piece and part and parcel to creating a better life, but also a better world. That's why you're here, to improve your life, to improve the world. Let's continue to be a light in the world. God bless you all.
Thank you for joining us for today's message. We invite you to be with us again next Sunday. At Unity, we believe that God's presence of love and goodness is everywhere, and that life is meant to be good. You can find out more about Unity and our teachings at unityhouston.org.